The memory always started the same way. The metallic taste of rain on her lips, the strange iridescent sheen on puddles that shouldn't have been there, and her brother Jim's labored breathing as they walked home from the park. That was 3 years ago, before she understood what cloud seeding really was, before she knew about the silver iodide particles and other chemical compounds that were being pumped into their skies under the guise of drought management. "Look, Nadia, rainbow clouds," Jim had said, pointing at the strange metallic shimmer in the storm clouds above. His voice was already raspy then, though neither of them knew why. 3 weeks later, he was in the hospital with severe respiratory distress. 2 months after that, she stood alone at his grave, watching another artificially induced rain shower soak the fresh earth. Nadia's desk at home became a shrine to her obsession. Scientific journals, weather modification permits, and environmental impact studies covered every surface. She learned that cloud seeding had begun innocently enough in the 1940s, when Bernard Vonnegut discovered that silver iodide could create ice crystals in supercooled clouds. The principle was simple: introduce particles that water vapor could cling to, thereby accelerating the precipitation process. But what she uncovered in her research painted a darker picture. While traditional cloud seeding used silver iodide or dry ice, Pristine Skies Corp had developed new compounds, hybrid particles combining metallic salts with proprietary organic polymers. They claimed these new substances were more effective at precipitation enhancement, but the environmental impact studies were suspiciously incomplete. Working late into the nights, she cross-referenced weather patterns with hospital admission rates in areas where cloud seeding was active. The correlation was impossible to ignore. Spikes in respiratory distress cases followed major seeding operations by 2 to 3 weeks. The particles weren't just seeding clouds. They were seeding something far more sinister. Her breakthrough came when she found a redacted EPA report mentioning unexpected molecular behavior in soil samples from seeded areas. The compounds weren't breaking down as predicted. Instead, they were accumulating in the soil, creating a toxic buildup that affected both plants and the people who consumed them. Worse still, the particles demonstrated a peculiar ability to bind with human lung tissue, creating microscopic lesions that left victims vulnerable to a host of respiratory complications. The official studies claimed the particles dispersed harmlessly, but Nadia's research showed otherwise. They were bioaccumulative, meaning they built up in living tissues over time. Each seeded rain added another layer of exposure, another chance for these engineered particles to find their way into human bodies. Jim hadn't died from a random respiratory infection. He'd been poisoned by rain itself. That realization led her to Pristine Skies Corporation. Their public face showed a company dedicated to solving water scarcity, but their classified patents told another story. Hidden in the technical jargon were descriptions of particles designed to persist in the environment, to change the very chemistry of the soil and air in ways that went far beyond simple weather modification. As she stared at her brother's photo on her desk, Nadia made her decision. Exposing the truth wasn't enough. She needed to infiltrate Pristine Skies Corp itself. She would become the spy in their skies, the witness to their atmospheric warfare. But first, she had to become someone else entirely. Eleanor Brock, newly hired lab technician with impeccable credentials and a spotless background. That was 6 months ago. Now, as she adjusted her lab coat and swiped her security badge at Pristine Skies' main research facility, she couldn't help but taste that metallic rain again. This time, though, it didn't bring despair, it brought determination. She would uncover their secrets, no matter the cost. For Jim. For everyone who looked up at shimmering clouds and saw only rain, not knowing they were watching poison fall from the sky. The keycard felt heavy in Nadia's pocket as she navigated the sterile corridors of Pristine Skies Research Wing C. 6 months of maintaining her cover as Eleanor Brock had earned her Level 3 clearance, but tonight she needed more. Project Stratos' files were kept in the secured data vault on Sublevel 2, behind biometric scanners and armed guards. The late-night silence was broken only by the soft hum of air handlers and the click of her shoes against polished floors. She'd memorized the guard rotations, knew exactly when Johnson would leave his post for his 2 a.m. coffee, creating a 4-minute window when the vault's entrance would be monitored only by cameras. Cameras she'd looped with pre-recorded footage during her routine maintenance last week. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed the modified keycard from her lab coat. The card itself was genuine, belonging to Dr. Victor Ramon, head of Project Stratos. She'd cloned it during a company dinner when he'd left his jacket unattended for precisely 90 seconds. The risk had nearly given her a heart attack, but now, as she slid the card through the reader, a green light blinked in approval. The vault itself was a cathedral of data, rows of servers humming like mechanical monks in prayer. She moved directly to Terminal 6, where classified research was stored. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, using Ramon's credentials to access the secured partition. What she found made her blood run cold. Project Stratos wasn't just about weather modification, it was about population control. The new seeding compounds contained engineered nanoparticles that could penetrate the blood-brain barrier. Initial tests showed they could alter human behavior, making people more docile, less likely to question authority. Pristine Skies wasn't trying to make rain. They were trying to make humanity easier to control. A file labeled Phase 3 Implementation detailed plans to expand seeding operations to major population centers worldwide. Casualty projections were listed as acceptable collateral damage. They planned for people like Jim to die. The sound of boots in the corridor snapped her back to reality. She'd taken too long. Quickly, she initiated the data transfer to her encrypted drive, heart pounding as the progress bar crept forward. 67%. 78%. 89%. The footsteps grew closer. 94%. The vault door beeped. Someone was scanning their card. 98%. The mechanism began to whir. 100%. She yanked the drive free just as the door started to open. Nadia's months of studying the vault's layout paid off. She slipped behind the tallest server bank, using the shadows cast by the emergency lighting to her advantage. 2 guards entered, their flashlight beams sweeping across the room. Motion detector was triggered at 0217, a gruff voice said. Full sweep. She counted 3 distinct sets of footsteps. The guards split up, methodically checking each row. Nadia stayed low, using the hum of the servers to mask any sound she might make. She'd memorized which servers ran hottest, creating thermal distortions that could fool the motion sensors. Slowly, deliberately, she moved between them. Row 3 clear, one guard called out. Row 4 clear, another responded. They were moving in a pattern, just like their regular security sweeps. Nadia had spent weeks observing their protocols, and now that knowledge kept her alive. As they checked the back rows, she inched toward the door, staying in the blind spots she'd mapped during her maintenance work. The vault door had been left open, standard procedure during a security sweep. Beyond it lay 30 feet of exposed hallway, then the junction that led to either the main security office or the building's service areas. She knew camera positions by heart. 2 in the hall, 1 at the junction, all with 3-second sweeps between blind spots. 1 guard's radio crackled. 2nd floor sweep beginning. Anything down there? Negative so far. Probably another sensor glitch from the temperature fluctuations. That was her chance. As the guards moved to the back of the vault, Nadia slipped through the door. She counted under her breath, 1 1000, 2 1000, then moved precisely between the camera angles, pressing herself against the wall in the shadows between the overhead lights. At the junction, she heard voices from the security office. The night shift was on high alert, but they were expecting someone to be running, to be obvious. Nobody looked for a lab technician walking calmly, head down, clipboard in hand, wearing the same white coat as 100 other employees. She turned away from the security office, toward the service areas. The loading dock would be watched, but there was another way out, the waste disposal area. She'd discovered it during her 2nd week, when she'd volunteered to help with lab cleanup. A small door, easily overlooked, led to the dumpster collection area. Nadia pushed through the door to the waste sorting room, moving with purpose. A real employee would belong here, would know exactly where they were going. The cameras saw only another late-night worker doing their job. The chemical waste dock was deserted, exactly as it would be at this hour. Her motorcycle waited in the shadows of the dumpsters, where she'd parked it 12 hours earlier during her shift. She was straddling it, key in the ignition, when she heard the first shout from inside the building. They would be checking the cameras now, realizing their quarry had slipped past them. But by then, Nadia was already merging into late-night traffic, the drive with Project Stratos' darkest secrets tucked safely against her chest. As she navigated through the city's empty streets, Nadia thought of Jim. "I did it," she whispered into the wind. "I finally did it, little brother." But she knew this was just the beginning. The real fight, getting this information to the world, was still ahead. and Pristine Skies would do anything to stop her. She took a circuitous route to her safe house, watching for tails, doubling back occasionally to ensure she wasn't followed. The truth about Project Stratos would come out, even if it was the last thing she ever did. Too many had died already from their poisoned rain, and she wouldn't let Jim's death be in vain. The safe house was a studio apartment in the industrial district, rented under a name that didn't exist. Nadia's hands were still shaking as she pulled out her specialized laptop, one that had never been connected to any network that could be traced back to her. She inserted the drive, her breath catching as she verified the files were intact. All of Project Stratos' dark secrets were there. The chemical compositions, the population projections, the casualty estimates they'd labeled as acceptable losses. But she couldn't just dump the raw files online. She'd seen too many whistleblowers discredited that way. Instead, she compiled a carefully organized dossier. Technical specifications matched with hospital records, internal memos paired with environmental impact data. Then she added the one thing she knew would make it impossible to ignore: her brother's medical records, along with those of 200 other victims from his neighborhood, all showing the same distinctive pattern of respiratory deterioration. At 4:47 a.m., she connected to Mac Gould's secure network. A system she'd verified was protected by multiple layers of encryption. She'd chosen him carefully over the past months, watching as he transformed from a gaming streamer into someone who asked the right questions, who wasn't afraid to challenge the official narrative. Her message was simple: the rain isn't what they tell us it is. Project Stratos files attached. Pattern of deaths begins page 394. They're not trying to save us from drought. They're weaponizing the sky itself. My brother was one of the first. He won't be the last unless this stops. Timestamp this. If anything happens to me, at least the truth will survive. N. She hit send, watching as the upload completed. Somewhere across the city, Mac would be receiving files that would change everything. Back at what used to be his family's cornfield, Eli Rogers stood at the edge, looking at what is now nothing but cracked earth and withered stalks. 3 years had passed since the Agricultural Enhancement Program destroyed everything. He could still hear his daughter Lena's rattling cough in the night, still see his wife Emma's skin growing paler as mysterious lesions spread across her body. The doctors were baffled, but Eli knew. He'd seen those planes cutting through the clouds day after day, leaving behind their silvery trails that the local news claimed would save the farming community from drought. The rain came, all right, but with it came death. First, the soil changed. Crops failed despite the increased rainfall, the earth turning an odd grayish color. Then the respiratory issues began. Lena was the first to show symptoms, just a small cough at first, dismissed as a cold. Within months, half the town was sick. The hospital waited list grew longer, and the death notices in the local paper multiplied. Emma lasted longer than most, fighting through 2 years of deteriorating health before pneumonia finally took her. Eli was one of the few who showed no symptoms. He'd spent those days in the fields, watching his neighbors' farms fail one by one, documenting everything. The government officials claimed it was a natural disaster, a perfect storm of unfortunate circumstances. But Eli had found the Pristine Skies Corp documents in the abandoned local weather monitoring station, reports of acceptable casualty rates and necessary population adjustment phases. For the past 18 months, Eli had transformed himself from a grieving farmer into a shadow, tracking Pristine Skies operations across the country. His truck, once used for hauling grain, now carried surveillance equipment and improvised explosives. He'd learned to hack their security systems from a former IT specialist whose family had suffered a similar fate in Idaho. Each sabotaged facility, each destroyed seeding station, brought him closer to the truth and to revenge. His map, spread across the back of his truck, marked every cloud seeding operation he'd discovered. Red pins for active sites, black for the ones he'd neutralized. The pattern was clear. They were systematically targeting agricultural communities, places where people were too scattered, too trusting, to question the dying land and their dying neighbors. In the mountains of Colorado, he'd found their maintenance logs, detailing the chemical composition of their seeding agents. In Utah, he'd photographed their secret loading docks, where unmarked trucks arrived in the dead of night. Each piece of evidence was carefully documented and encrypted, sent to secure servers that would release everything if he didn't check in every 48 hours. Now, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of red over the Montana peaks, Eli checked his equipment one last time. The mobile seating station ahead was their newest model, supposedly environmentally friendly, according to their press releases. His intel suggested it was actually their most lethal version yet. Tomorrow it would be reduced to ashes, but first he needed their data. He couldn't let another community suffer like his had. He couldn't let Lena and Emma's deaths mean nothing. The weight of his rifle pressed against his back as he began his approach. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about stopping them before they could perfect their weapon. The clouds above gathered, dark and threatening, as if nature itself understood what was at stake. The mountain facility loomed before him, its metal walls reflecting the last rays of sunlight. Security was minimal. They relied on isolation as their primary defense. Eli moved silently through the shadows, placing charges at key structural points. Years of watching their operations had taught him their vulnerabilities. The sound of rapid typing froze him in place. Someone was still inside. Through a narrow window, he caught glimpses of a woman in a lab coat frantically searching through filing cabinets, muttering curses under her breath. She moved with purpose, checking drawers and computer terminals. Not a regular employee. Her movements were too urgent, too desperate. Eli drew his weapon and entered through the side door. The woman spun around, hands raised. Her ID badge read Dr. Wilson, but her eyes held the same haunted look he saw in the mirror every morning. Step away. Eli's voice was steady, harder than steel. No more poison in the skies. Not on my watch. Wait. She gestured toward the computers. The evidence. It has to be here somewhere. We can't destroy this place yet. There must be proof of what they're doing. Her fingers drummed anxiously against her leg. The network's down, I can't access anything remotely, but there has to be something physical, files, hard drives, anything. And if I don't trust you? Eli kept his weapon trained on her. Then you'll doom more people than they ever could. She met his gaze unflinchingly. How many more towns need to die before someone exposes the truth? The words hit him like a physical blow. Before he could respond, alarm klaxons shattered the tension. Red lights began pulsing throughout the facility. Security breach in sectors 2 and 4. Emergency protocols initiated. The computerized voice echoed through the facility. Weather control systems engaging. The woman, clearly not Dr. Wilson, cursed. They're activating the system remotely. We need to. The building shuddered as machinery roared to life. Through the windows, Eli watched in horror as massive cloud seeding devices oriented themselves toward the gathering storm clouds. Help me shut it down. Not Dr. Wilson was already at the control panel, her fingers flying over the keys. They've locked us out of the main system, but there might be a manual override. A pounding at the main doors made them both jump. Security team en route. 2 minutes to breach. Eli made his decision. I've got charges set. We can still bring it down. Wait. She yanked open a filing cabinet, rifling through folders. There has to be something. Her hand emerged clutching a thick manila envelope marked Phase 2. Atmospheric collapse. Thunder cracked overhead as the seeding devices hummed with increasing intensity. The storm was growing unnaturally fast, the clouds boiling with sickly green undertones he recognized from that terrible day 3 years ago. 1 minute to breach. We have to go. Now! Eli grabbed her arm. She clutched the envelope to her chest as they ran. They barely made it to the tree line when the first explosion ripped through the facility. The charges detonated in sequence, just as planned. But nature had plans of its own. The manipulated storm unleashed its fury. Lightning struck the damaged facility again and again, as if drawn to the chaos. Eli and the woman who still hadn't given her real name huddled under an outcropping, watching as the perfect storm they'd helped create tore the facility apart. One particularly massive bolt hit a seeding tank, and the resulting explosion lit up the night sky. When the dust settled and the storm began to dissipate, they finally looked at each other. I'm Nadia, she said simply, holding up the envelope. And I think what's in here is worse than anything we imagined. Eli nodded grimly, thinking of Lena, of Emma, of all the others. Then let's make sure everyone knows about it. The envelope felt heavy in Nadia's hands as she opened it, revealing schematics and reports that pointed to something far more terrifying than isolated attacks on rural communities. This was just the beginning. Phase 2 was something else entirely.